Medfield TV, community shows.
Hi, I'm Lucille Fisher, and in this next session of our series, Our Town, Our Land, Our Future, we're going to be talking about the potential agricultural uses up at the former Medfield State Hospital, the area surrounding the core campus. We're also going to be talking about passive recreation. Today, I am interviewing Gil Rodgers. Gil is a member of the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee. He has also studied extensively agriculture and passive recreation for the last 3 years, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that. He also has personal involvement with community-supported agriculture, and this kind of fuels his passion. So, Gil, tell me, how did you get interested in the history of agriculture and the possibilities for it up at the Medfield State Hospital?
Well, thank you, Lucille, for this interview. Actually, I grew up on upstate New York in a rural area, and my grandparents had large farms in the area, so I had that right from the beginning.
Wow.
And then later on, my son, Andrew, got involved with community-supported agriculture, and that kind of got it started for me. But I think that the interest in the Medfield State Hospital was that the agriculture and the farm were a very major part of the whole project there. So I became very interested and fascinated with trying to learn more about it.
So tell me now, what is your background in agriculture? And you've told us a little bit, but your son has a CSA, but other CSAs in this region.
Yeah, he started with a farm in South Hampton called Green Meadows Farm. It was part of the Patton Estate, large farm, and made that very successful as a CSA, Community Supported Agriculture. And I used to work up there when I could, but maybe one day a week. But I had a lot to do with helping him get that farm turned around and made into a very large and very profitable CSA. And then later on, he became a partner and the general manager, the farm manager of another large farm in Carlisle, Massachusetts. And this was the Clark Farm. This is a large dairy farm up there. The same thing, having worked with him on it, I learned a lot about that model and the benefits of it. And then in addition, I became interested in a farm, Cider Hill Farm, which is in Amesbury, Massachusetts, almost on the New Hampshire border. And I wrote a case study. I have a relationship with Northeastern University, and they were interested in a case study on sustainability, but particularly sustainable agriculture. So I wrote a case study for the school, for the business school, and then I teach that class. So I've been doing that, I think, for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Very popular class.
I
We
can
bring in
imagine.
the owners and we talk about various issues about sustainability in agriculture.
I can imagine that's a very popular topic right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very,
A lot
very
of interest
popular.
in it.
So, can you briefly summarize the legislative and land use provisions for agriculture and passive recreation? What can and can't be done?
Yeah, that goes back a little bit because when the town was negotiating the purchase of the hospital with DCAM, the state, one of the things that had to be done after the town approved it was to actually write the legislation that transferred the property, which was part of DCAM, to the town of Medfield, but also to other agencies. And I was on the legislative committee at that time. So in addition to helping guide the decision to purchase the land, I had a hand in writing the legislation. And part of it that I really was very insistent on is that the lands that are beside the core campus, so if you can visualize the layout, you have the core campus, which is about 94 acres, which is where all the buildings are.
Right.
But then on both sides, on the east side and on the west side, you have these large plots of land that are basically hayfields now.
Right.
We call those A1 and A2. A1 is to the east and A2 is to the west, toward the river. And so we put in a provision in the legislation that said that those properties would be transferred to DCR, the Department of Conservation and Recreation. But there were very strict stipulations that those properties could only be used for three things. For open space, just leaving it open. Of course, there's a huge interest in that in town. For agriculture, and we'll get back, of course, in more detail about that, but for agricultural purposes, and then three for passive recreation. So they were restricted to those. Then after the legislation was passed by both sides of the legislature and then signed into law by Governor Patrick, then after that, a purchase and sale agreement called the Land Disposition Agreement, or LDA for initial, takes the provisions in the legislature and then puts them into detail, sort of like a purchase and sale agreement when you buy your house. And those provisions and those restrictions on those lands were put into the LDA. In addition, the property that we bought across the road, across Hospital Road, called the Sledding Hill, that's also agricultural land. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about that because that's where the farm was located, right in that area. And most of that area was also used for agriculture. And the LDA then stipulates that all of that has to stay as agriculture, except there's a provision that, kind of a carve out, that 12 acres is exempt from that and could be used for some type of development. That's to be determined yet. So that's sort of the history of the legislation.
And that 12 acres, does that have to then be designated somewhere else?
The 12 acres has to be offset. There's what they call a mitigation provision, so that the 12 acres had to be offset by other property in town, which it was. And that's an important part of the law in Massachusetts, that agricultural land has to be maintained or has to be mitigated. So if you take 12 acres out, you have to offset it by another 12 acres, and that was done with the Holmquist property on the south section, south side of Medfield.
Right. Very good thing for us. Now, the committee has put out several surveys. So we've had a chance to hear feedback from the Medfield community about agriculture, gardening, and passive recreation. Can you give us kind of a synopsis of what people have said?
Yeah. The last survey, there's been 3 surveys, as you said, and the final one that was done, I think, in September-ish time frame, had a series of questions directly about agriculture. And what it asked is, what would people like to see, and tried to get feedback. And the gist of it was that overwhelmingly, I would say of almost all the survey results, it was almost the clearest in terms of what the preferences were for the community. And they really love this idea. For example, I think it was something like 77% of the people wanted to see some type of farmer's market similar to what we have downtown in Medfield at the church. But
Right.
that was one big interest. Another was to have a farm stand of some sort, where you could go in and buy vegetables or fruits at least during the growing season. Another category was CSA, the thing I've been mentioning about the background I have, and I think it was something like 66% of the people said that they approved or strongly approved a CSA, and so forth in other categories. I think one of them that I was particularly interested in was A1 and A2, and I think it was like 60% of the people said that we should pursue the use of agriculture on those two properties. So and there was a bunch of other categories and questions, but the overwhelming evidence was a support for pursuing agricultural on the properties in A1 and A2.
Okay. So there are definitely some agricultural opportunities. So can you tell us what some of these possibilities, would be?
Yeah, I should clarify too that as I'd mentioned in the legislation and in the LDA, A1 and A2 are being transferred over to DCR, not to Medfield.
Right.
Okay, so one of the questions has always been, well, why are you thinking about agriculture in these two properties, which are really under the purview of a state agency? And we should come back and talk a little bit about that. But in terms of how it might be used for agriculture, I think a very good example that's not right in this area, but not too far away, is in Southampton. In Northampton, Massachusetts, near Amherst College. And there's a thing called Grow Food Northampton there. And it's a very kind of similar situation. And I went up with some of the colleagues from our committee, and we visited it and spent a day, touring it. And it's kind of like a mixed-use agricultural. It's not just a farm, it's not just a CSA, it's not just community gardens, it's all of these things, in different parts of it. And I think that that's a possibility here. So what are some of the options,
Right.
Well, we could have community-supported agriculture. Now, we have some, of course, Tangerini Farm in Millis, and we have Powysset Farm in Dover, and there's several others in Dover. So we have some of those already, right? But that could certainly be one of the applications as a CSA. Another application that you could have is you could have some type of a commercial farming again. You could have possibly a cattle farm again. That's a possibility. And there's other specialties too. Like, for example, you could have community gardens. As I've traveled around and looked at other hospitals, they often have community gardens. Boston State, for example, has very successful. I think it's they have a number of acres that are just for community gardening. So you could have that type of thing, and other specialties too, like that. So I kind of visualize it as a mix of different types of agricultural things, and you could go through an RFP process, the same way that we're talking about for the main core campus for that, and see what kind of interest there is from the community.
Right, and when you talk about community gardens, I think of the Victory Gardens in Boston, and they're magnificent.
Yeah.
They are magnificent.
Yeah, and you take advantage of the wonderful soil and condition that's up there.
I know. That's something we don't want to lose. So let's talk a little bit about passive recreation. So can you explain what passive recreation is?
Yeah, that's very important for people to understand. If you read the state legislation, state laws, passive recreation is very clearly defined in there. And what it basically means, it's recreational activities, but that don't change the topology. In other words, you're not moving land around, you're not cutting new paths, you're leaving it as it is. That can't destroy or disturb the topology or the ecology. So you can't affect that. You can't cut trees down, that type of thing.
Right.
And it can't involve motorized vehicles. So you can't have motorbikes or all-terrain vehicle, ATVs, or things like that on it. So that's kind of what it can't do. Right? But what it can do is be things like hiking, walking, dog walking, I guess,
Hiking.
hiking, bicycling,
Bicycling.
mountain biking.
Yeah.
It can be bird watching, which is going to be very interesting up there with
Yes.
the new gateway that's been
Yes,
opened up,
yes.
and you already see,
It's a migratory path.
coming back.
It
It's
is. It's
amazing
beautiful.
what it is. So I go up there quite a bit, and there's a lot of photographers that go up there now. I'm all the time bumping into photographers that are taking pictures of the river, or of the fields in the back, or the hospital itself. So it can be used for photography. Passive recreation could include cross-country skiing if we get snow this year.
Wonderful.
I know
Fun.
Mark is
Oh,
all
yeah.
interested in cross-country
Oh,
skiing,
yeah.
so you could go
Loves
up
that.
there. You could
And he
use
has been up there,
Yeah.
cross-country skiing.
horseback riding.
Yeah.
We use
Yeah.
it for the Norfolk Hunt Club, because it's got this amazing trail system all
Right.
throughout it. So it could be used for that. So it's that types of applications that are in passive recreation.
Yeah, thanks, that's great. Now, why do you feel that local agriculture would be of benefit to the Medfield community?
Well, that's a big question. I mean,
Yes.
that's a big loaded question.
Yeah.
Now, having this sort of personal interest in local agriculture and working with my son on this, we have a belief that the way that the country and the world is going toward mechanized or industrial agriculture, these huge farms, with all this equipment and stuff, is not sustainable. As the population grows and there's more demand on the food system, that model, I mean, I'm sure it'll go on forever, but it's not sustainable in many senses. That the alternative is to go back more like we were in the past, in the 1800s and 1900s, and have more local farms, local sources of food. Now, what's the benefit of that? Well, the benefit is, of course, you get much better food, right?
Yes,
If you're getting
sure.
your vegetables from a farm that were picked yesterday
Yeah.
or today, first of all, they taste much better. We have the advantage of getting all this food directly
I
from
know,
my
you're
son's
very
farm.
lucky.
And you can't believe the difference in the taste. You think
Oh.
that celery is celery or carrots are carrots.
We
or
belong to CSAs, and the difference
Unbelievable
is
difference.
amazing, and the variety.
And the variety and like he does a lot of different types of spinach, and carrots and potatoes and things like that.
Yeah.
Although there's a lot to be said about this, there is probably benefit and value from a nutritional point of view. That you're getting stuff much fresher, you're not using the pesticides and the herbicides or the
Yes.
hormones in the food.
Yes.
So it's a much better food. So
Yeah.
for you, for your kids, your family, it's a much better source of food sources than than buying through the big industrial system. The other thing too, I'm all very interested in climate change, and of course right now we have the huge meeting going on in Paris, about climate change, and one of the things that you worry about is emissions of carbon dioxide and other pollutants into the air. If you cut down the supply chain, if you shorten it, so you're not trucking stuff,
Right.
from California to Massachusetts or flying things from Central America, into Massachusetts, which we do. When we
Right.
say, it's all the time that's going on. You're reducing that carbon emission. So
Yes.
you're helping in a sense, maybe in a small way, but a significant way, with this real concern about climate change. Now, the other thing just to add too is my son's farms, both of them, both the Green Meadows farm and now the Clark farm, were organic farms. So that's a whole process you go through. But by organic, what it does is it puts very strict conditions on the quality of the soil, on the use of pesticides and herbicides, cultivation, things like that. So if it's organic, so suppose up there we had an organic CSA, then you're getting even a higher quality of food.
Right. Sounds good to me. Tell me, how much land is there in the surrounding area, and how suitable is it for for the agricultural activities that we've discussed?
Well, If you look at the land now that are in A1 and A2, now we know, of course, that the town has purchased the core campus and the sledding hill. But if you look at the land that's kind of the horseshoe around it, okay, there's, we think, roughly 50 to 70 acres of farmable land. Okay, now that means land that you could actually go out and, you know, and cultivate and plant in. And I'm not counting anything, for example, down near the river. There's this big, of course, you know, wetland and aquifer that is protected. That will stay under DCR, so I'm not counting any of that. I'm just counting the main fields where you could potentially have agriculture. So something like 50 to 70 acres. In terms of the quality, the state ranks land and soils by its nutrition, you know, by what kind of nutrients it has in it, the pH, other characteristics to it. And that property is prime agricultural soil. So it's very high quality soil. And then I've met with different people that are in farming around this area and had them look at it and give me their opinion of it. And it's ideal in many respects. It's ideal because the land is relatively flat. So it's big flats. It's not, you know, hilly and rounding. So if you look at A1, the hay field, it's a big open flat field more or less. So that's great. The second is that the shape of the field. You know, you think, well, what difference does that make? But for agriculture, particularly commercial agriculture, you like to have big rectangular lots. And it's like that. It's laid out like that. So that's another real plus for it. It's relatively clean, and by clean they mean rocks. You know, what's hard is if you get a property that has lots of boulders and rocks on it and stuff, because then you have to clean it up. And the other characteristic that's important is drainage. You know, you want land that's going to, if you have a big rainstorm, that's going to naturally drain off. And the property has a natural slope to it. For example, A2 over near the river is sloping down toward the river, so it naturally drains down in that direction. And the other one on the east side drains into it. There's a stream that runs right through it. And the stream is important because it could be a source of water, too. One of the big issues of the farm is where do you get water? You know, how do you irrigate the fields? And that could be a source for water.
Now, I have actually heard of the soil referred to as black gold. That it is that high a quality. By a landscaper. Who actually, Monique Allen, who was involved in the whole restoration, she called it black gold.
You know, a good way of illustrating that is if you look at the property on the west side, that big field, I call it the garden field. Because that's where, when the farm was in its heyday, that's where they had the major vegetable and flowers. They grew a lot of flowers, vegetables and flowers in that big piece of land. And from all I understand from talking to people, it was very, very productive. So that would be an interesting place to do some of these things, maybe community gardens or CSA, because as you say, the property has amazing properties for growing, you know, fruits, vegetables, naturally valuable
resource
of
natural resource.
Very hard to find that, incidentally, Lucille. I talked to Al Volante, and he said that, you know, you just can't find land like this in this area. You know, big pieces of property, 50, 70 acres, which is a large piece of property that has those great characteristics to it. Very rare to find it.
We don't want to mess with that.
So,
in my opinion. So there used to be farming at the State Hospital. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of farming up there?
Yeah, it's a long history and there's a lot to it, but just a few highlights. This originally were large farms that were in this area before the state even built the mental hospital, for example, the Bishops, the Hardings, you know, Moses were large farms in the area. And the state acquired that property probably in the early 1890s, 91, 92. That's when things started to get going there. The farm was up and working pretty much from the beginning of the hospital, which was 1896 when it actually kind of started. So it goes way back to that point. The farm itself was huge. unbelievably huge. I think that's what makes me very interested in it. It had 2 large barns, and one was what we call the dairy barn, and that was right down near, I mentioned the sledding hill, right down in that area. And this was a cattle barn primarily. The main theme of the farm was cattle. There's lots of other stuff, but if you want to say, you know, what was the main driving force, it was dairy cattle. And they had on the order of 100 head of cattle, which is good sized. Plus they had probably another 50 yearlings or so, young cows that were coming along. So they had a breeding program. They had 2 bulls there. They had a separate bull house. They had 250 pigs at one point.
Wow.
That was quite separate. They had them way down at the north end of the field toward the Dover-Sherburne Regional School, so it was quite a ways away.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
right,
for obvious
the smell.
reasons.
Yeah,
250.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a lot.
They had, I think it was like 3,000 chickens. You know, it obviously varied.
That is
It's a lot of chickens,
amazing.
right?
That's a lot of chickens.
And it was very interesting where they kept them. They had a hennery, you know,
Yeah.
which is like a chicken
Yep,
house,
I know.
at sort of the top of the sledding hill. And the sledding hill was actually an orchard. If you look at the sledding hill and think about it a little bit, it was an apple orchard, and there's still apple trees there, old apple trees, you know, but that was all apple trees. So they had all the chickens running around, you know, in the apple orchard. And then, of course, they had lots of eggs, and they produced all this produce. The farm was created pretty much self-sufficiency.
Right.
So that all the, you know, the meats, the fruit, the vegetables, you know, all the produce were produced at the farm to supply the hospital. And keep in mind that the hospital, you know, patient population got up over 2,000. Plus you had all of the workers, you know, which is another 600-700 people.
Right.
So it produced enough food for the whole place and exported it. It had too much, you know, so it would ship it out to other hospitals in the area. So it was an amazingly productive farm. In total, you know, I've mentioned these, we've talked about A1 and A2, but it had lots more property. So the farmland went all the way to the Charles River, you know, where the old Route 27 was. They'd leased land way over to the Hinckley Farm, which is near Ice House Road. The land went all the way north to where we think of the Dover-Sherburne soccer fields. So it was probably on the order of a total of maybe 800 or 900 acres of land. So it was a big, big place. And of that, I've seen statistics that 400 acres maybe were tillable, what they could use for agriculture. So you
Wow.
get the scale of the thing. It was big.
Enormous.
Yeah.
And most of the patients, didn't the patients work
Yeah.
the land?
Yeah.
as
One
well?
of the things, before, you know, if you go back before about the mid-'60s, let's say, they had, you know, they had a farm crew, a permanent farm crew, a paid farm crew. But as you say, they had patients that wanted to get out of the buildings, you know,
Right.
wanted to get outside. And so they worked in the fields. For example, at harvest time, they might have, you know, maybe 100, maybe 10% of the patients, something like that, working at the barn or working out in the fields, harvesting crops or helping in construction and building. So, and you know, and it was very beneficial.
Right.
Not just for the fact that you got more labor,
No.
but also for them. You know,
For fresh air.
it was fresh air. It was getting out
Doing
of these
something
buildings,
purposeful.
and they had a purpose.
Right.
And one of the things that I talked to people about was it was good from a vocational, you know, occupational therapy, I guess we'd call that today.
Yeah.
But also it was good because it was work. You know,
Right.
it was heavy, you know, physical work or being out in the field all day in the sun, that type of thing. And one of the benefits of that was that they came home tired. And so they would sleep. And that was one of the real beneficial effects or side effects from having the patients involved in it. It all closed, it's kind of a sad ending in a way, in, it was April 1967. And a lightning strike hit the main dairy farm this big, huge barn.
Wow.
And according to, I've met with the sons of the farm manager, Nowers, Nowers twins, and
Yeah.
they said it was an explosion.
Oh, boy.
They were sleeping, and they heard this huge, like it was a bomb. And I guess that happens with a lightning strike, with a big barn that's full of hay and stuff, and the building just exploded, apparently.
Wow.
They got all the animals out. No animals were injured, but it destroyed the barn.
Yeah.
And then another lightning strike. They had a second barn over in A1, over in that hay field, a hay barn they called
Yeah.
it. But that was also huge. And that also got struck by lightning at a different time, in a different storm. So it knocked out their two big buildings on it. And that was really, I think, the turning point for it, around 67. And then, it was a question of, do you rebuild these barns, and what do you do? But then at the same time, there's lots of changes going on in patient care and the philosophy of how you treat these patients.
Right.
Drug therapy came in, and that became kind of really the end of the use of it, for medical, psychological purposes, and then it kind of died out in terms of the patient population. But I think that event was really quite a decisive moment for the farm itself.
That's unfortunate. Okay, so really the prime available agricultural land is in the large fields to the east and to the west of the core campus.
Right.
And that's owned by the state.
Yeah.
So have you had any discussions with state officials about how the use of those lands could kind of roll into the reuse plan for the state hospital property?
Yes. I've met with several people. Barbara Hobson, who is at DAR, Department of Agricultural Resources. And she's responsible for all of the DAR properties in sort of eastern part of the state. And I've met with her twice. Once we just had a talk about it, and then this summer I invited her to come out, and she actually walked the whole property with me and Steve Brown to look at the whole property. Now, DAR, as I'd mentioned, A1 and A2 will probably be hasn't transferred yet, but will transfer over to DCR. But because the use is really stipulated to agricultural purposes, probably the responsibility for managing it, for actually making decisions about the use of the property, probably will go to DAR. Okay, that hasn't been finalized yet, but that's what Barbara said would most undoubtedly happen.
So Department of Agricultural Resources.
Yeah. And they're very supportive of this. She, first of all, just was very positive about the potential for the land, about using it, bringing it back for agricultural purposes. So she was, the other thing she said it was I think, very important is she said that they would work with our master planning committee to help in guiding or designing how those properties are used such that it was in a way consistent with whatever our overall design is for the core campus and the sledding hill. And what does that mean? Well, being involved with all the planning we're going through with what we see is people are very, very intent on having open space. Right. Okay. Well, this contributes an enormous amount because you have like hundreds of acres around there that are open space, right? Restricted for open space. But one of the things that's important about open space, I think, is you have to have access to it, I mean, if you have a forest someplace and it's landlocked or you can't get to it or it's isolated, yeah, it's open space, but it's useless open space, So one of the things that we think is important is to some way or other integrate the access to those properties through, trail systems or ways that you can walk around it, that you can walk around down by the river now, but you could walk around, you could extend the trail systems. You could make it part of the Bay Circuit Trail system that's going in that area, or the Charles Link River Connector Trail. So you could integrate that in. So I think one of the things that we're thinking about as we're looking at different use plans for the core campus is how do you integrate that with these big agricultural properties or open space or passive recreation areas that are on both sides of it. So we think that the two, really are very consistent and very complementary to each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's a win. That would be a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So, in closing, are there any points that you want to make about the possibilities for agriculture and passive recreations that perhaps we haven't already covered?
One thing that I've seen, particularly in working with the Clark Farm up in Carlisle, Massachusetts, is that they've done a lot of very innovative things in taking the school system and integrating it in some way, or taking advantage of the fact that they have this beautiful farm. So what they do, I think it's almost from kindergarten or first grade on, and it often gets integrated into their science curriculum. But what they do is they introduce the kids to agriculture. So, I've been up there, and they'll bring the first or second grade group over with the teachers and everything, and they'll show them shearing sheep, for example, or they'll have the kids go out and pick eggs from the egg house, or they'll maybe during the summer they'll have the kids go out and dig potatoes or dig carrots, things like that. Because most kids don't know that, I mean, they see this stuff in the Brothers or Roach Brothers or Shaw, and they think that's where it comes from, but they don't get the idea of what it means, what the whole cycle is. So one of the things that I think would be interesting, and that, encourage the school, committees and teachers and superintendent to consider is how you could take advantage of this agricultural gold mine that's right in our area, but integrate it more into the educational system. I think education and agriculture have a big role in the future, and we should promote that and develop that.
Yeah. And also, isn't there the possibility of maybe if there is a farm there that we might be able to supply our school system with fresh foods?
Yeah, they do that.
Local foods?
Yeah, that's a good point. In Carlisle, for example, my son supplies fresh vegetables and blueberries and fruit and strawberries, to the local school, which is, like a mile away or something, not even that, quarter of a mile away, so that the kids are getting advantage of the produce that's grown right in that area. So that would be that's a very good point. That'd be another possibility up there.
Another a great benefit.
Yeah. Definitely.
To having that kind of land.
And they've integrated into the curriculum so that, we talked a little bit about sort of just having the kids go over and look at it, but you could put it into the whole science curriculum. And that's what they've done, so as kids get older, they start to learn about soil science, let's say, and what's important, what nutrients are important, what chemicals are important in the field. Why do you compost? So they learn more about the basic science and more technical aspects of farming, but it becomes part of the curriculum or a section in the curriculum. Yeah,
again, a great thing, because these are valuable resources that we don't want to lose in the future. So anyway, I thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge of agriculture and passive recreation and CSAs, with me today and the community. I want to thank Medfield TV for hosting this series on reuse and redevelopment of the state hospital grounds and its structures. For more information, you can go to www.mshvision.net. That's our website. You can find a whole host of information there. You can also go to sign up for our newsletter that comes out once a week. You can also friend us on Facebook, and it's MSH Vision. And the other thing is, I believe you and Gil, you and Roz Smythe had written an article on the history of farming at Medfield State Hospital, and the community can read that there on the website. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next show. Thanks very much.
Medfield TV.